We're really delighted to have with us this evening David Rothkopf. David is one of those Washington individuals who's moved ably between the worlds of public service and private business. After an initial career in magazine publishing, David shifted into government during the Clinton administration, where he served as Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce. He then returned to the private sector, where he helped manage Kissinger Associates and founded his own advisory firm. Today, he's the CEO and editor of the FP Group, which publishes Foreign Policy Magazine and the foreignpolicy.com website. And he's a visiting professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University and a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also written several insightful books on issues involving national security and business. They've included, in 2005, Running the World, about the National Security Council. In 2008, Superclass, about the global power elite. In 2012, Power Inc., about the complex relationship between public power and private power, that is, between government and business. And in 2014, National and Security, about the making of U.S. foreign policy in an age of fear. His new book is called The Great Questions of Tomorrow. This is a TED book. TED books are published by Simon & Schuster and define themselves as, quote, small books about big ideas, meaning they're short enough to read in a single sitting, but long enough to take a deep dive into a particular topic. Those topics can range from architecture to business, from space travel to love. Each TED book is paired with a related TED Talk, and the books tend to pick up where the talks leave off. In David's case, his TED Talk occurred a couple of years ago under the title, How Fear Drives American Politics. It has since drawn well over 1 million, I think it's up to nearly 1.2 million viewers, and basically makes the point that we as a nation, especially since 9/11, have been too focused on terrorism at the expense of more significant, more profound trends that are reshaping our future, trends in technology and demographics, in the environment, in the way people around the world are interacting with each other. David argues that we need to do better at bringing people together who know technology and science with people who lead our government so that they all start posing better questions about where we're heading and begin addressing those questions in more creative ways. Now, in his book, David highlights some of the questions that we, being in a world on the verge of epochal change, ought to be focusing on. Questions that will prompt us to reimagine such basic aspects of our lives as identity and community, our social contracts and our rights, who rules us and how we work. This is clearly pretty fundamental stuff, and I think we're in for a very provocative discussion this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Rothkopf.
That introduction was better than the book, actually. So, no, thank you very much for that. It's a pleasure to be here. After you do books for a while and you go out, you discover the parts of putting out a book that you like and the parts that you don't like. The part you like is finishing the book. The part you don't like is writing the book. But I only ever go to one bookstore now when I do this for a talk, and that's here. Because this place captures, to me, the kind of ideal of a bookstore as a community gathering place, as a font of ideas, and really sort of part of the intellectual life of the community. And that's why I'm glad you're here. And what I'll do is I'll talk for 20, 25 minutes about the book, and then we can have questions. But here's what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about he whose name shall not be spoken. I'm not going to talk about today's headlines. Because the point of my book is that we spend far too much time trapped in the news cycle. And in those rare moments that we're not trapped in the news cycle, we're actually looking backwards. I look at the phenomenon of American politics right now, and Russian politics, and Turkish politics, and Israeli politics, even Chinese politics to some extent. And in each case, I see leaders who are the last leaders of the 20th century. I see leaders who are trying to cling to an ideal or an idea of how society works that is, if not antiquated, it's old. Vladimir Putin wants the world to be like it was during the Soviet Union. The President of the United States wants the world to be like it was in the 1980s. Marine Le Pen wants the world to be like it is prior to the European Union. They're clinging to the past, and there's a lot of danger in that. And the point of the TED talk that I gave was that, we have spent in the United States the past 16 years focused on terrorism, focused on the last threats of the 20th century, focus on real issues that are not existential issues, that are not driving change in a big way. And we do this at our peril, because by looking backwards, we run the risk of missing the big changes that are actually coming at us. I start the book with a little vignette of myself when I was 17 years old, and I was watching television, and there was a television show about nuclear winter. You could say I was a cheerful kid. And I watched this show, and it said, if there were nuclear war, the environment of the planet would be destroyed and 100 million people would die. And I was kind of upset by this because it didn't seem out of the question. And so I went in search of my father to talk to him about it. And it was a kind of a nice spring day, and he was outside someplace. My dad was a scientist. He was also a Holocaust survivor, and he sort of had a particular perspective. And he saw, as soon as he saw me, that my facial expression was kind of grim. And so he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, I've just been watching this documentary on nuclear winter, and if there's a nuclear war, 100 million people will die. What will be the point of going on living?" And he said, "Yes, but what's wrong?" He was kind of perverse character, and he was trying to tweak me a bit. He was a contrarian as a scientist, and I said, "Well, that'd be ghastly. It'd be a terrible thing." And he said, "Well, 100 million people have died before in human history, in the 14th century." And he said, "And shortly after that, we had the Renaissance." He said, "Sometimes big traumatic changes produce unexpected consequences." Now, I want to tell you rather quickly, he was not advocating that 100 million people die. I mentioned this on a TV show recently, and I immediately got a lot of tweets from people saying, "That's Nazi. You're promoting the death of 100 million." I'm not. But I thought there was a useful lesson. If you lived in the 14th century, you would be focused on the plague, or the Great Schism, or the Little Ice Age. And you might miss the fact that the result of the plague was that the workforce in Europe changed, and people could demand more for their services because there were fewer people. And the advent of the water wheel and some other things led to the advent of the middle class. And that there was this guy named Petrarch, and he started writing about classicism in a way that caught on. And as this century of turmoil unfolded, the next thing that you knew, you were in the Renaissance, and you were in a completely different period of change. And if you weren't prepared for it, you would have fallen behind. And the chapter in the book is called "The Day Before the Renaissance," And in it, I'm essentially making the case that we're in exactly that situation now. That every so often in human history, there are changes that are so sweeping that they leave behind the ability of institutions and systems of belief to keep up with them. And that when we change that rapidly, it causes disruption. And while I am an optimist, I don't believe you can study human history and not be an optimist. I'm serious. If you're rigorous, you have to note that people live longer now than they ever have. They're healthier now than they've ever been. They're better educated now than they've ever been. They're wealthier than they've ever been. They have access to more information and more art and more culture than they ever have. We're in a remarkable time, and we see this progress going forward. But when we get these moments of disruption, we very often have upheaval until we adjust to them. And you had the 30 Years' War, you had the revolutions in the middle of the 19th century that came with the Industrial Revolution. You certainly had the wars of the 20th century. And I'm concerned that we are going to miss out on preparing for the changes that are around the corner. And I think those changes are of a once in every 200 or 300 year level, and they're going to actually happen in the next 10 or 20 years. For the first time in human history, every person on the planet will be connected in a man-made system, which is to say, the internet, by the virtue of this, within 10 years. Virtually every person on the planet, the poorest people on the planet, the richest people on the planet. And what it means is that everybody, anywhere, can reach out and touch anyone, anywhere else, anytime. We will all, for the first time in human history, be in one single cultural ecosystem. And that culture was sort of contained within borders. But borders obviously mean less. And this is a great opportunity for us to enrich ourselves, but it will also produce backlash. And one of the things that is a recurring theme in this book is that the profound technological changes that are coming have big upside and big downside, both of them almost all the time. And so we have to prepare for that. And so what I do in the book is I say when we get to these big moments of upheaval, the questions that we need to ask have to become more fundamental. And that we are at a point that is so great that some of the questions that we're going to be confronted with are, who am I? Because for most of human history, we define our identity by the virtue of who's close to us. It's geographically defined. And we're entering a period in which geography is going to play less and less of a role, and affinities in virtual space will play more and more of a role. And we've seen this, by the way, right? In the most negative sense possible. ISIS goes out and they find people who are alienated anywhere in the world. And they say, let's make common cause. And they can connect and they can create non-state movements that are cross-border and very powerful. And so we're going to have to ask, who am I and how do we define ourselves in that world? And if you ask, who am I, one of the other things that comes out of that is, what is a community? What is the nature of a community? If it's not geographically defined, but defined by affinity, if it goes across borders, then what does that mean? How does that affect governance? How does that affect how we organize ourselves in society? And some of the questions that follow on from that are almost impossible to get our brains around, but are really essential. So we have to ask questions like, what is war now and what is peace? What is money? What is a job? What is life's purpose? Because all the things that are about to change in our lives. In terms of war and peace, think about it. During the Cold War, the price of war was so high that no one dared fight it. But we're now in the era of cool war, cyber conflict. And the price of not fighting is so high that no one may dare stop. Because it's almost impossible to determine who is waging the war. And it's almost impossible, therefore, to determine how we respond. And you know, we've seen that. I mean, think about it. The biggest cyber hack of political consequence of our time was last year's election. And this week, the President of the United States had the foreign minister of the country who did the hack in his office to discuss when he was going to meet with the leader of that country, because we don't know how to deal with it. When Sony was hacked by the North Koreans, the White House scrambled to try to find language to refer to it. And they ultimately called it vandalism, because they didn't want to call it an attack. Because if they had called it an attack, it would have required a certain kind of a response. And, you know, if somebody, you know, if a bunch of North Koreans had come in a little rubber boat, walked into Los Angeles, gone into the Sony building, and blown up a bunch of computers, and the computers actually blew up, we would say, okay, well, you know, now what we have to do is we have to go and make them pay in the same way, in a kinetic way. But we don't have the doctrine for this. We don't have the words. We don't have the vocabulary. We don't even have leaders who understand how to talk about it. I was talking to General Mike Hayden, who was one of the top folks in our intelligence community about this, and he said he would go into the White House and brief people on cyber, and they would look. He said they looked at me like I was Rain Man. Because they didn't understand what he was saying, because we don't have a generation of leaders who are actually trained to understand cyber. But it's not just cyber. It's not just conflict. It's economics. Think about it. You know, 20 years ago, Alan Greenspan was always referred to as the most powerful man in the world, because he controlled the big monetary tools that we had. You know, we had a fiscal tool and a monetary tool. And that's how we controlled the economy. But I think we're going to look back on that period as the Jurassic period of economics. You know, where, I mean, this is just crude, right? Because when you go into the big data era, and we're about to enter a period 3, 4, 5 years from now when there are 50 billion devices on the internet, those devices will give real-time information on economic activity down to the block level, to the front of this store versus the back of this store. And, you know, when you look at government economic data right now, first of all, it's defined by national boundaries, which is a very crude. The correlations within the boundaries of a country are very mixed. But I could, you know, come up with, using this new data and finding new correlations, I could come up with, you know, Davidstan, you know, which would be a country of 10 million people who are almost exactly like me. And I could come up with new stimuli that I could use. But I will also be able to do it in real time. Think about it. You know, one of the biggest innovations in using technology of 20 years ago was that in New York City, they introduced something called the CompStat police data tracking system. And so prior to this, you would get crime data once a month. And so it took 3 months to determine whether there's a crime wave. And once they started tracking it using computers, it took 3 days to determine when there was a crime wave. And you were able to go and redeploy people to nip it in the bud. We'll be able to do the same thing economically. We don't have to wait 3 quarters. We don't have to use a crude measure like GDP. We are going to have all sorts of new measures. But that's going to require a new kind of economics. And it's going to require economists who actually understand this. You know, another thing, you know, I would have thought that the last election would have been about how do you create a job? Because we don't know. For most of American history, if you have GDP growth and you have productivity growth, then you have job growth and you have wage growth. But starting 7, 8 years ago, that stopped. In some respects, it stopped 20 or 30 years ago. And so we have to ask ourselves a question, which is, how will we create jobs and wage growth in this environment? And we're in the early stages of this with automation. You know, there's a philosopher that I refer to in this book, a guy named Nick Bostrom, who studies artificial intelligence, wrote a great book called Superintelligence. And he went out and talked to all the people in the world of artificial intelligence and said, when is this going to be a reality of our lives? And some said 30 years, and some said 40 years, and some said 50 years. And none said 100 years, and none said never. And what does that mean? Well, it means that a lot of the work that we do is going to be done by machines. And, you know, I sometimes go out and I'll talk to a crowd like this, and they'll go, oh my God, this is terrible. You know, it's terrible because, you know, we'll have all this time on our hands. And I'm like, do you really believe that? You know, I mean, bosses have been selling this for a long time, this kind of notion. You know, your work for me is how you define the meaning in your life. But if you had more time on your hands to spend with your family, to read a book, to write a poem, to grow spiritually, to travel, I mean, that's what the purpose of life is. That's, you know, and we could be moving in that direction. But our whole economic system is not set up to address that yet. We don't know how to deal with it. Now, there are some countries that are exploring it. In Finland, they're exploring this idea of a basic national income, which is one way to deal with that. And there are other countries that are doing this. And, you know, I could go on and on. You know, I think that to conclude, some of the most important questions have to do with what kind of society do we want to be in. The social contract is going to change. We too often define the value of our society in terms of how do we make GDP grow? How do we create wealth? But we're at one of those moments where we could make a different answer, that it's about quality of life, or it's about bringing us all together in different kinds of ways. And we have the opportunity to move in that direction if we ask the right questions now. But we have to recognize there's some challenges here. It took 350 years to get from the Gutenberg and the printing press to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And in the middle, you had the Glorious Revolution, and you had John Locke, and you had philosophers thinking about this and debating it. Well, it also took 350 years to get from the first book to the 100 millionth book. And it took 70 years to get from the first telephone to the 100 millionth telephone. And it took 33 days to get from the first edition of Angry Birds to the 100 millionth download of Angry Birds. And what does that mean? What it means is that the world is changing faster than our institutions and our leaders have the ability to come up with the new ideas, the new philosophies. And this, at the core of my TED Talk, the question was, where are the philosophers? We need to be asking these questions. Like, what are our rights? What are your rights in the internet world? Do you have a right to the internet? Well, you can't be a citizen without the internet. You can't get a job. You can't be educated. In many countries, you won't be able to vote. And there are now 10 countries in the world that have actually granted in their constitutions a right to the internet. But if you have a right to the internet, does that mean you have a right to electricity? Now that would have sounded like a crazy idea, 100 years ago. But if you don't have electricity, you can't actually be on the internet. And so we have to go back to some of the fundamental questions. Questions about privacy, questions about the role of government, questions about the nature of taxation and property rights in a world where much of what happens is virtual. Your kids, your grandchildren will never drive a car. The car will drive itself. They will never hold paper money in their hand, because with blockchain and everything else, it's going to be electronic. They may never know what a central bank is, because economic policy is going to be driven by something completely different. And so the point of this book is to say we're 10 years away from the first moment that everybody on the planet's connected in a man-made system. We are seeing that the nature of warfare is changing, that the nature of peace is changing, that the nature of money is changing, that the nature of jobs is changing, that the nature of how we value our lives is changing, that the nature of taxation and how governments work will be changing, that the nature of economics is changing, that these are all changing in profound ways. And we're talking about 30,000 terrorists, mostly who live in caves in the Middle East, who don't pose a threat or cannot affect this kind of change. We're talking about leaders who would like to have a debate about yesterday. And we need to change the conversation. And so the purpose of the book is to say, here are the questions. Let's change the conversation. Let's drill down. And I'm happy to drill down with you in any of these areas. If you have a question, step up to the microphone and ask the question. And I'm happy to go in any of these areas. Yes.
Right. So I don't know how I want to phrase the question, but a lot of what you're addressing is that in order to say how should we live, you need to define a set of values. And of course, there's going to be conflicting sets of values. How would you propose or address two sets of values that essentially come into conflict, which is not a new question, but somehow we're going to need a space for ideas to compete with each other in order to choose a direction.
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of a fan of democracy, and I think we need systems that are open to this kind of debate that adapt with it. The problem is most of the institutions we have are kind of antiquated. They're not up to changing as fast as we need change, and we are not having the conversations about how they should change. And if you went around the world, you go, and I've gone around the world a lot in the past year, and you go and talk to millennials in countries around the world, the one of the first things they say is, we don't trust the institutions. And it's not just government institutions, it's the church, it's FIFA, it's academic institutions, it's social institutions. And these things need to change to adapt to this. But I think, that the tools that we've got through the advent of this new technology is going to present us with many, many ways to float these ideas and have this kind of debate. We just need to be able to have it in a more civil way than we're having a discussion right now in our country.
Hi, I have a PhD in economics. I got it in the 20th century. Here we are in the 21st century. Who are the thinkers now I should be, reading, listening to, and which books could you recommend?
Oh my God!
Too many. All right.
It's big, but I'll just give you one example.
Sure.
So, Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT, who wrote The Second Machine Age, have done a lot of thinking about how automation is going to change the nature of work, and framing some of the questions that we're going to have to deal with there. And there are other people who are doing that kind of thing. But, I think part of the question is about what? I think there's some interesting work being done on the nature of work. I don't think there's much interesting work being done on what comes after macroeconomics. Because, I think, macroeconomics, which is, those two sort of Jurassic tools of monetary policy and fiscal policy based on nation states, it's over. Because if you're moving into the world of big data, sensors everywhere, new kinds of correlations, being able to go from multivariable models with eight variables in them to multivariable models with 1 billion variables in them, then we are going from macroeconomics to nanoeconomics. We are going to be able to come up with policies that are like smart bombs, that are precision guided right into a place. I don't think there's a lot of discussion of that going on. So with your PhD and the fact that you're here, I think this is a book writing opportunity for you.
Thank you very much.
Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson, they did 2 books. One is called The Second Machine Age, and what's the other one called? Well, there are 2 books there.
Thank you again for coming. I'm a big fan of the magazine and podcast. Speaking of occupations, I'm a high school history teacher, and I was curious. You talked about the 20th century and the Alan Greenspan example. As someone who's a professor now, I'm curious, what have you seen in your students that you were surprised about, that they knew or did not know? And as someone who's seeing their seniors graduate, what ideas or questions would you like me to lay out for them going into the, now that we're really into the 21st century, what do you see as like the next thing you want students to really learn and grapple with?
Well, the course I teach at Columbia, which alienates everybody else around me, is essentially a course saying what are the next generation foreign policy challenges. And it's essentially saying that the old models that we have are obsolete and that we need new models. That, trade models that we have are based on antiquated trade data that's wrong. They don't take into consideration services. They don't take into consideration the internet. They don't take into consideration intra-company trade in a real way. And we need new ones. We need new doctrine of war. We need, all the things that I've just talked about. And I find that most academic institutions want to teach the books that have already been written. And, the part of history that's interesting to me is the history of disruptions, the history of periods that are like this, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or the Reformation and the 30 Years' War or
Nixon.
Well, that's a different level. But because what I'm interested in here is that these are changes that occur across all areas of society, in science, in economics, in culture, in politics, in the underlying philosophies of life. There are moments like that where everything connects across, and I think we need to stop and ask questions about what might happen tomorrow that's different from what happened yesterday.
It seemed to me from your presentation that you were identifying electronic technologies as essentially the main drivers of this very rapid change that we're experiencing. Is that the case?
No.
And if not, what are some of the other major drivers of rapid change that you've identified in your work?
Well, I mean, clearly, biological changes, biosciences, neuroscience. We're about to enter an era in which our understanding of how the brain works, of how we genetic science, how we can cure certain kinds of disease and so on, are going to change the nature of life in really profound ways. An average 10-year-old American has a 50% chance of living to be 100 years old. When you talk about what is a profound change in society, for almost all of human history, in the workforce there were 2 generations of people. And we're about to enter a period very shortly where there are 4 generations and maybe 5 generations of people. We're about to enter a period where, thanks to information technology, people won't retire. I mean, if you recall the big debates that took place in Washington in the 80s, or Al Gore and the lockbox, we were worried about how we were going to pay for retirement. But I think what we may discover is that we're going to actually be able to harness the expertise of the most experienced population using new technologies to keep them economically viable for much longer. And that is going to make their lives rewarding, because actually the thing that kills people is retirement. And that's going to make their lives rewarding, but it's also going to create economic growth. So, I think the changes in biosciences may be bigger than the changes in information technology, more profound. And when somebody comes up to you and says, I can give you a pill that will make you feel what you feel like when you fall in love, because I understand the brain chemistry of love, it's going to change a lot about our philosophies of life.
A curiosity question. How a lot of your ideas are applicable and definitely foreseeable for well-developed areas with large infrastructure, whether it be in small or big countries, major cities and capitals, for smaller rural areas or for like less well-developed areas, do you still see an impact because a small town in America or overseas in a little country in Africa or Asia, they may not have, let's say, the technological access or other things? I'm just curious, do you see this happening?
Actually, it's very interesting. The reality is that because now computers are phone-sized, and many countries in Africa have 80% cell phone penetration at this point.
Okay.
And more than half of all the cell phones sold everywhere in the world are smartphones right now. So they're essentially computers. That you are now getting, applications that allow a goat herder in Kenya to understand the price of goats in different markets, bring things to market better, and you're also seeing leapfrogging of technologies. You may have heard of mobile banking, where there are there's something like 1.4 billion people in the world who don't have a bank account. But in Tanzania and Kenya, there are now over 15 million people who do their banking on their cell phone. And I think actually the breakthroughs they've made in mobile banking are going to come to us. That we are going to embrace some of these things. I'll just give you another example. I was talking to somebody not too long ago who was dealing in rural-most Africa and was trying to increase crop production. And discuss, and the way that was done was you would send somebody out, they'd look at the soil, they'd look at, they'd have to go back periodically and so forth. Now he does it with a drone. And a drone flies out and it does spectrography, and based on the spectrography, it determines whether the soil is being fertilized properly, and if it's not, they then FedEx to those people the nutrients that they need from the ground. So there are applications that are happening in those parts of the world as well.
Okay.
Thanks. How bad do you think things are gonna get? How like this? I would prefer to think not so much, but stuff is wild. What should we be prepared, like, on what level?
Well, first of all, I wasn't prepared for most. I have a book here about the future, and everything that's happening in the United States right now, I was completely blindsided by. So I'm not saying don't buy the book, but I have to say the political developments of the past year have been kind of shocking. I'm concerned because we can get climate change is obviously a big one, but I'm also concerned because a lot of what you see in extremism in the Middle East is a reaction to this kind of connection, this kind of new connection in this wired world, right? And I think we see some emerging tensions, and I'll just tell you about one that I'm very interested in right now. There's a lot of discussion that we live in a world in which there's a tension between globalists and nationalists, right? Now, I'm happy to talk to you about globalization later on because it's sort of the story of all of human history, and it's not actually something you can opt out of, right? But I don't think that's the divide. The real divide right now, politically, in most places in the world, is between cities and hinterlands. And if you look at the way the elections went in the United States, the cities went one way, the hinterlands went another way. If you look at Turkey, Istanbul and Ankara went one way, the hinterlands went another way. In Moscow, in Russia, even when Putin ran the last time, Moscow went against Putin. The rest of the country went in a different direction. The cities are actually the places that are globalizing fastest, connecting fastest, because they're hubs where you have telecommunications technology, transportation technology, and capital. And then that draws good people there and so forth. But I don't, I think that's weakening national governments, and it's creating new models. Abu Dhabi and Dubai each have 90+% expat populations. They are truly global cities. The Pearl River Delta in China, Hong Kong, Macau, Shenzhen, 60 million people. This is essentially an urban area that's the size of what most major countries in Europe were 20 years ago. I think we're entering a period where some of the fault lines are going to be unexpected fault lines, and we're going to have to figure out how to reconcile those. So I think it could be pretty rough. Now, having said that, look at Europe recently. They saw where we went, and they're now reacting to that in a way that has to be seen as fairly positive. So as I say, medium term, long term, I'm optimistic, but I'm a little cautious about the near term.
Hi, thanks for coming. Also a big fan of the magazine and the podcast. You touched on what I guess you could call the political economy of automation and AI, and you talked about the great benefits of being able to write poetry and be with family instead of working. But you also mentioned that might mean that income is accrued to those who own the capital, the machines, and when I think about these issues, I think maybe we all ought to be cracking open our old college copies of Das Kapital and thinking about that. And I guess I wonder, that would be a great world if we can distribute the income enough that we can all enjoy the leisure. And I guess my question is, do you think we have is the social compact strong enough for us to develop those kind of mechanisms? And if not, what do we do to
I think there's going to be
better?
a lot of upheaval around it. I do think, I'm a capitalist, I'm not a Marxist, but I do think that, Marx had a couple of things right, and one of them was that he recognized that when you took capital and the means of production and you put them together, you had a big advantage. And when you take them and the means of production are technological and they don't actually need people anymore, which is the new part of this thing, you can actually promote even greater inequality. And I think, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if some of the biggest debates of the next 20 or 30 years sound very familiar to people who are reading what the debates were like in the 20s and 30s about distribution of income. Because I don't think we understand how we will want to distribute income. And I think there are other societies that do it better than we do it. This book I wrote, Power Inc., one of the points of the book was we thought the end of the Cold War meant the end of history. And what it turned out was we've ended up with a competition between different forms of capitalism. And, some of the other forms of capitalism work a little better. And I'll just give you one quick example. During the last financial crisis, 2 car companies went bankrupt. One of them was GM, and the other was Saab. Now, in the United States, we didn't have a social safety net. So if GM went under, there would have been 1 million people out of work, and it would have cost the government a ton of money. In Sweden, they had a system for retraining people and taking care of people, and nobody, the social safety net was much stronger. So what happened? Well, we had to bail out GM, and they let Saab fail. So which country is more capitalist? The one that let the market take its course on Saab, because they had built the social safety net, or the one that couldn't do it because it didn't have the social safety net? And I think, we're going to see new models emerge. And, one other point of this is throughout human history, when the center of economic gravity shifts, the center of intellectual gravity shifts. And so, it was in Europe for a while and it came to the United States. Well, center of economic gravity is shifting to Asia. And I think we have to be open-minded that many of the answers to these questions are going to be, they're going to have a trans-Pacific intellectual component to them. And that's going to, they're going to sound different from the ones we're used to.
Thank you.
Do you have time for one more?
I do, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This was so interesting. You talk about, and I completely agree with the idea that we need to be looking forward. And I know you said we're not going to talk about he who must not be named, and hopefully this question doesn't make you, but we're also
that's Voldemort, by the way. But
we're also in a very interesting time in where we're having to explain some of the principles that we've known, the rule of law, attacks on the judiciary, attacks on the press, all of these things are forcing us to go back to some of our basic principles and explain those in a way I think certainly my generation hasn't had to grapple with before. So how do you sort of reconcile the two, and do you have any insights on how we can speak to some of those folks in the hinterland, as you mentioned, given your thesis of wanting to look ahead?
Well, I think it's important to to say we're having two different discussions, right? But the discussion about these massive social, technological, scientific, institutional changes that are down the road is related tangentially to what we're going through now, because we have leadership that wants to turn the clock back, right? But having said that, the political crisis that we're in as a country right now is separate from these discussions in many ways. And I honestly, I said I would avoid it, but I don't want to minimize it. I think we're in a political crisis right now. I think that the leadership in the White House and leadership on the Hill are not showing a sufficient appreciation for their constitutional responsibilities, for separation of powers, for ethical guidelines, for a whole host of things that I think will produce a crisis. I think the next several years are going to be very rough in American politics. But we grow from these things too. And the genius of the American system is, and the genius of the U.S. Constitution is that it's designed to refresh itself. It's small, lean, and flexible, and that when we confront these kind of issues, we grow from it. And we grew from Watergate, and we were strengthened by it at the end of the day. And I remain optimistic. I mean, I don't think it's going to be easy to get from here to there. And the one thing we mustn't do is normalize what's happening. And I worry about that. The president's going to go off to Saudi Arabia and he's going to sign a deal, and everybody's going to go, oh, look, he's acting like a president. But if he does that and he, does the other things that he's doing, that's not normal. It's adding the trappings of normalcy over something that's much more disturbing and dark. But we live in a system that reinvents itself all the time. And the greatest genius of the United States is that we reinvent ourselves all the time. And, and economically, the United States is the best country in the world to go bankrupt. There's no stigma. You can try something and you can fail, and the system is designed to let you get back up on your feet. And I think politically, because of the way our elections work and because of the way our system has checks and balances in it, I think that at the end of the day we will end up stronger on the other side.
It's a hopeful note.
Thank you.
Thank you.